Hello. I want to thank ADL for allowing me to participate in this important conference remotely and apologize for not being there in person. I so wish I could be. I also want to thank ADL for their critical leadership. At this time of rising anti-Semitism, we need them more than ever. Their information, their expertise, their leadership of the communal response, and their deep partnership with each and every one of our Jewish communities and our Jewish federations. As president and CEO of the Jewish Federations of North America, representing 146 Jewish federations and hundreds of smaller network communities, I can speak personally about the partnership we have with ADL and thank all of their teams in the communities, their national team, and of course my friend Jonathan Greenblatt for his leadership. I also want to acknowledge, of course, Rabbi Cytron-Walker for your leadership, both as a religious leader and now, importantly, as a leader on the subject of security. My friends at the Community Security Services who do such important work in training community volunteers, and of course, all law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. Thank you for all their support. We are living at a time of extraordinary, flourishing Jewish life in North America. This is the most successful, freest Jewish diaspora in the 4,000-year history of the Jewish people. But at the same time, we are facing the rise of violent anti-Semitism. This has also been the most violent time in Jewish life in this country. If we're going to continue to have flourishing communities, we must have strong security. Parents won't drop their kids off at the JCC or at summer camps or day schools. People won't come to synagogues if they don't feel safe. This is the basic prerequisite of success of our Jewish communities today. And I thank all of you for your efforts in this regard. Jewish federations have accepted this responsibility as leaders of each of our communities to make sure we have professionally designed and run community security initiatives. We are in the middle of a program, a campaign we call Live Secure, which is to ensure that every single Jewish community has, based at their federation, a professional community security initiative within 3 years.
Because I know you often get a lot of bad things happening, a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric rising, a lot of incidents happening, but very few times do you get to talk about what can you do. Because the doom and gloom, it's out there, but there is some optimism. There are people that are willing to help you and to try to introduce you to ways that you, your community, you personally, or as congregants in a synagogue, students in the yeshiva, can try to help that situation, or at least make you feel safer and more comfortable going about your daily work. What I'm going to do very quickly, because you don't need to hear from me, is introduce my very illustrious panel here with some brief bios, and let them tell you a little bit about what they do and how they want to engage with you. Following that, we'll do some questions and answers. As I started with, hopefully, the audience, if you think of something, no questions off limits, but we'd love to hear what's on your mind. First and foremost, I'm a little embarrassed. I'm going to have to read my notes, which over the years are written very, very large, much larger than they used to be, to introduce my very good friend, Evan Bernstein, who is the CEO and National Director of the Community Security Service, which the ADL works very closely with, the national leader in Jewish volunteer security. He has helped lead its national expansion, opening offices in Stamford, New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. He also spearheaded national partnership agreements with the ADL and the Secure Communities Network, SCN. Evan is regularly quoted in national news sources discussing the need for Jewish-led volunteer security teams that work in partnership with private security and local law enforcement. He came to CSS, I'm very proud to say, from the ADL. We crossed over for about 3 weeks before he went over to CSS, and he was the vice president of the Northeast Division. So I'll let Evan talk a little bit. I'll introduce each speaker as we go down.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really, it's a pleasure to be here. It's weird to be here actually as a non-ADL staffer, being at ADL for 7 years, and it's great. I'm really excited to be able to talk about volunteer security, and it's been a wonderful partnership with you and your team at ADL. CSS was founded in 2007 as an organization that replicates a lot of the work that organizations around the globe and the diaspora do with leading Jewish volunteer security, where Jews are really responsible for their own safety and security in their communities and work in conjunction with law enforcement. And when I took over the organization 2 years ago, we were a very hyper-local organization, and we're able to expand into the number of offices, and we have over 2,000 active volunteers around the country that are really highly trained at being able to help protect their institutions. And at CSS, our biggest piece is trying to empower the Jewish community. For many years, I was talking about anti-Semitism and talking about anti-Semitic acts, and I really wanted to be able to do something about anti-Semitism, especially proactively. And what CSS does by training volunteers across the country and training them at a high level to do safety and security awareness, to report incidents back to the Center on Extremism or the SCAN duty desk, to get them aware of what's going on in their community is going to make us a better and safer community, and is going to allow for people to be, as they're empowered, to really be able to take ownership over that fight against anti-Semitism in a way that many Jews just can't do. And I think what's interesting about what CSS does is we really are a force amplifier, not only for their partner organizations, but also for local law enforcement on the ground, whether it's the FBI and the field offices or local police. Our people, once they're trained and they're empowered, they're able to do things that only volunteers can do. No one is going to care more about who's inside your synagogue than a volunteer. No one's going to care more about the family and friends that are in that synagogue than a volunteer. No one's going to know the nuances of the physical plant of your synagogue the way a volunteer does. I was on shift myself on Yom Kippur, and I was standing with a local law enforcement officer who was doing security for us, and he didn't understand why people were walking to the congregation with sneakers on. They don't understand some of the nuances. They don't know the difference between a tallis bag and a backpack. They don't understand little nuances about why the door would be open because there may be a caterer there for the bar bat mitzvah. And there's questions that we can ask as volunteers once we're well trained that make us incredibly invaluable to the community and to our partners. And I think what's so critical for volunteers as we go through was the quality control of CSS. The training that a volunteer gets in Seattle is the same training that they get in New York and that they get in Atlanta. And we have a security council, which Greg is part of, that includes Mark Gardner, who's the former head of the Secret Service for the United States, that ensures that our training, so our volunteers are at the highest level possible in order to allow for that quality control and to make sure that we are able to work at the highest level with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. So we really are hoping that more people can get engaged, not only be empowered as Jews, but to also be able to push back on anti-Semitism. And we now know at this conference, the numbers that the FBI is putting out, what the Jewish community is going through, the anti-Semitism, the growth of anti-Semitism over the last decade, we as Jews need to find ways to be able to get empowered, and we hope that you can choose and look at CSS as an opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Evan. And before we move on, and I have a brief comment to make about each one of my co-presenters who didn't realize this. I mentioned I was a first responder to the Jersey City incident. There was one person there before me, and that was Evan, who was right on scene when we arrived while the shots were still ringing out. And Evan immediately, we had recognized each other, came over with his staff, said, "We're from the ADL, what can I do to help?" And throughout that, the event starting, all throughout the aftermath and dealing with the community, the ADL and the Jewish community pulled themselves together, and I always remember Evan for that, and it's one of the reasons that brought me to the ADL, even though he left me 3 weeks after I got there.
We're still friends.
Yeah. Our next presenter, it probably does not need an introduction, but I will do it anyway, Rabbi Charlie from Temple Emanuel, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Special advisor to the ADL most recently, only a couple months now, I believe. Rabbi Charlie became the new rabbi at Temple Emanuel in Winston-Salem in July. He previously served at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, since 2006. On January 15th, 2022, Rabbi Charlie and 3 congregants were held hostage by a gunman in the sanctuary of the temple. After an 11-hour standoff, all the hostages were able to escape when Rabbi Charlie threw a chair at the gunman, distracting him long enough for everyone to get out of the building. Since then, he has spoken out on the importance of security training for religious communities, and especially small congregations, as well as the need to build stronger bridges between faith communities, especially on a local level. He has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives, Judiciary, and Homeland Security Committees, and has been published in news sources including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He has also been interviewed and/or profiled from outlets from CNN to CBS. In 2022, he was honored as a hero against hate by the Texoma Anti-Defamation League, and currently, as I mentioned, serves as our special advisor. Rabbi Charlie.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here on many different levels, and at many different levels, I am very grateful to be here. We are hearing a lot about the rise in anti-Semitism, and it is obviously very concerning, and it should be a source of concern. It's also something that I do believe that we should take a deep breath, because it's amazing that thanks to the work of the ADL and so many others, we do have a lot of love and support in the community, and in many different communities and across the country and throughout the world. And it is important to acknowledge that sense of support that we do have, because what happened to me, when somebody comes in believing these lies, he really believed with all his heart and with all his soul and even with his life that Jews controlled the world, that Jews controlled the media. He believed it. He may have even believed all the lies about blood libel. He may have even believed, who knows? But there have been so many lies, so many things that have been said about our community for so long. And it's so damaging. And when it's out there in the world, right, we need that sense of pushback, but there are things that we can do that can have an impact in our communities. And one of the biggest things, right, because everything went right in my situation. Right, I said this at our healing service that we had 2 days later. We didn't have to say Kaddish. Incredibly grateful. And many of the things were happenstance and chance and luck. And there were several important pieces that remain enduring lessons and takeaways from that day. And so I want to start off with the idea that all of the things that we had done helped. It is a pain in the butt. It is a real challenge to put together an emergency action plan. It is time-consuming, it is detailed, but for congregations and organizations to think through all of the horrible things that can happen, to think about what happens in case of a fire, what happens in case of a tornado or a hurricane, what happens in case of a child, right? If there are children and there's a school, what happens if a child goes missing? What happens if there's a medical emergency? And of course, what happens if there's vandalism or another form of an anti-Semitic attack? Thinking through those pieces and figuring out not what the best way to respond is in general, but the best way for your organization to respond and to train on that and to figure it out. Those are things that we started that process 6 years before the incident. Because for the first time, we started learning about that. That was after the Mother Emanuel AME Church, the horrible shooting there. Having trainings, whether they're trainings that CSS provides or whether they're trainings that the ADL provides or SCN or the FBI, local law enforcement. In North Carolina, we just are setting up 2 sessions in December where we can learn about how to respond when there's an active shooter. For those of you who have been through those trainings, they're not fun, but they're necessary. They're vitally important. To go through, we had the local sheriff's department come in and do a security assessment of our building, and they're not local law enforcement isn't the only one who does it, but they tend to do it well. And to go through and figure out what are the infrastructure needs, from cameras to physical structures to our doors opening or closing the right way or the wrong way. There's all sorts of things to consider. I'll tell you that the 3M film over glass, we learned in Colleyville, that's very effective. Like the FBI tried to get in at the end and they had a hard time getting through that glass. And one of the other important things is relationships. You can't expect a relationship to exist when something bad happens if you don't put the time and the energy and effort into those relationships in advance. All of these things take time. You can't rush it. But when you have good, solid relationships, and I was literally texting with the chief of police that day, who continues to make fun of me because I'm like, is there anybody else I need to alert or tell? And he's like, I think everybody knows. But that idea that there's relationships with local law enforcement, with your institution, that there are relationships with peoples of other faiths, other nonprofits, that those relationships exist, that you're doing things together, that there's a reason for it, not only in case something bad happens, because it has an overall general positive impact on your community as a whole. When you're building relationships, good things happen. And so at the end of the day, we do have to, right, to save a life is to save a world, and that is one of our values. It is also a value, right, to love the stranger and to love our neighbor, to be a part of, within our community. And we need to try to do all of that. And it's all a part of this notion and this understanding of doing security and creating a sense of safety for all of us. When our entire community feels safe and secure, how many extremists, right? It really kind of gets rid of the need for extremism to exist. We need to do that for all people. And we need to look out for ourselves too.
I mentioned I was going to have something to say about each one of my speakers, and Rabbi Charlie, there's 2 points I want to make on that. One, we did not know each other in January 2022. I was at a friend's house, my phone went off, and I recognized the FBI main number, 324-3000, as one of our guests will say, and I thought immediately, it tells you how much I retired, oh, my pension's screwed up somewhere. Not there's an emergency. But got on, and it was hold for the director's office. Now you know there's a problem, and they went right into it. Was the deputy director. We have a hostage situation down in Colleyville, Texas. We're looking for, and again, without being humorous, my first thought was, do they know I retired? Why are they calling me? But they went into, it involves a Jewish community. It's in a synagogue. Can the ADL help us? We don't know what we're going to need yet, but we know we're going to need to talk to the community. And I'm in New York, and it said, let me make 2 phone calls. One was obviously to Jonathan Greenblatt, who immediately said, absolutely, anything we need, we're on standby. The other, and I'll embarrass her because I see her out there, was to our Texoma, then the regional director, Cheryl Drazen, who I said, Colleyville, Texas, I've never heard of it. She immediately said, I'm turning my car around, that's Rabbi Charlie's. I know him, and by the way, you can tell the FBI and law enforcement they had installed an internal camera system that they didn't know, which became very, very critical. Law enforcement hadn't gotten that information yet where they could plug in and start observing it. The last piece, and for the good Rabbi Charlie, because he says it better than I do, in retrospect, and we said there's this degree of optimism, I can guarantee you, and he's never heard me say this, but I use it when I present, that Rabbi Charlie and that congregation did not say, you know what we need to prepare against? A foreign actor in a foreign country is going to travel to the United States, land in New York, travel across the United States to Texas, picking up weapons along the way in order to free an ISIS-inspired terrorist held nearby in a major city. No, anybody who says now I was preparing for that, no. But what they did do, they prepared. They took all the steps. They said something could happen. Let's take the steps. Let's make sure we're trained, including as the law enforcement. A lot of my colleagues here will tell you this. The number one saying in a crisis, and as Evan saw, is not the time to say, hi, my name's Greg. It's before that. It's just what he said. I called the chief of police. We knew them. We had a relationship. It's hard. But if you take those steps and prepare it, how much safer does your community and your congregants feel? And so my hat's off to Rabbi Charlie for taking all those steps and leading them. And now my final 2 panelists are sweating, wondering what I'm going to say about them when they get done. But in order, Leigh is the founder and CEO of Tall Poppy, where she helps companies protect their employees from online harassment. She was previously a technology fellow at the ACLU and worked at tech companies including Slack, Salesforce, and Microsoft. Leigh has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto, where she majored in computer science and equity studies. Leigh.
Thank you for that introduction, Greg. I'm really thrilled to be here in illustrious company today. I really, really appreciated what you said, Rabbi Charlie, about preparation, because a lot of what I've been thinking about in coming into this panel is really the lessons that I've learned around preparation from the world of cybersecurity that translate into physical security. And in sort of critical incident response within tech, we talk about this idea of you build a playbook so that you build playbooks for all the scenarios you can anticipate, so that when the scenarios that you can't anticipate happen, you have some kind of preparation, something to start with. You knew you needed to throw that chair, even though you didn't know all of the other circumstances. And I think there's a real analogy there for dealing with the cyber threats that start to extend into the physical world. We used to talk in the sort of discourse around online harassment. There was this really sharp distinction between IRL and online threats. And I think what we've really seen over the past decade, in particular with anti-Semitic threats, but a lot of threats that come from a place of bias, is that there's no more IRL. This is all just real life. When stuff starts online, one of the real threads that I've seen through my work around online extremism is that the same people who are engaging in threats against LGBTQ communities, against people of color, against women, there's often an intersectional element to it where those same people are engaging in anti-Semitic threats. There's a real sort of versatility of hate that we see in a lot of the threat actors that we deal with, where whatever their target's identity is, that is the thing that they're going to seize on in engaging in online violence towards them. When we've seen when we've seen issues escalate into the real world, often, and we're going to talk about this a bunch more on the panel as well, there's this sort of inevitability of looking back at the digital paper trail, the digital evidence trail of a perpetrator of physical violence, that they've been engaging in targeted harassment, in cyber stalking, in hacking attacks, targeting people who have some sort of marginalized identity for a long period of time. And some of those people may have tried to report it, they might have tried to seek help, and when we as a society aren't prioritizing, investigating, and following up on those leads, we're really missing out on incredibly valuable signal that has the potential to protect us from violence. So I think I'm really glad that this is part of the conversation today, really connecting that sort of online discourse, online dialogue, and the kinetic violence that we're seeing. So thank you, and I'm a little nervous about what Greg's gonna say about me now.
It's not going to be that bad. First, I will tell you how we came to meet Leigh, but first she has also encouraged me to dye my hair gray. So I appreciate that.
There's a lot of gray under the pink and orange, I gotta say, the past couple of years.
It's a joke that we've used before, she and I. But in all honesty, the ADL, as you can imagine, and other organizations, we have increasingly had cyber threats and people kind of going after our employees. And we started to get very, very concerned as the rhetoric has increased over the last years. So we looked around and said, who can we outsource? Who can we partner with to help our employees and make them feel more comfortable, even in our work that we do, so we can be effective? And the name that came up over and over again was Tall Poppy and Leigh. So we went to them and made her services and her company's services available to all ADL employees. And at first, when we looked at it, said, you never know it's going to be received. Now we're worried that she's not going to be able to keep up, but she has been, because all of our employees who do use the Tall Poppy services come back and say, thank you. I didn't think like that. It's very interactive. It's exactly what I was looking for, and I feel better, which is the common thought. I feel like I can go about my work and not worry about this being assaulted on the cyber realm. So thank you very much for that, Leigh. Last but certainly not least, before our questions and answers, from my former agency, Supervisory Special Agent Stephanie Post. Stephanie joined the FBI in 2008. I'll get this out of the way first. So I think I had almost retired then, but no, that was all right. And has worked in the Chicago, Omaha, Puerto Rico, and Little Rock offices. In 2018, she was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Little Rock. In 2021, a Supervisory Special Agent Post was awarded a promotion to Unit Chief in the Domestic Terrorism Operations Section of the Counterterrorism Division at FBI headquarters. In this role, she leads a team of supervisory special agents, intelligence analysts, and support staff in the program management of domestic terrorism cases in the Northeast region of the United States. Additionally, Agent Post has served as the Domestic Terrorism Coordinator for the Domestic Terrorism and Hate Crimes Fusion Cell, the FACE Act Task Force, which deals with women's reproductive rights, and the Foreign Influence Task Force. Agent Post has an undergraduate degree in sociology from Kansas State University and a master's degree in criminal justice from Loyola University in Chicago. She is married with 1 child. Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It is truly an honor and so humbling to be here with these panelists and in front of you all. I never thought in a million years I'd be here today when I first started the FBI 14 years ago. So thank you for having me. It is a true honor to serve you every day and keep you and your community safe. The first thing I'd like to do today is kind of explain to you all a little bit about domestic terrorism. So the first thing I think it's important to understand is that there is no criminal statute that makes domestic terrorism illegal. There is for international terrorism. So it's illegal to support an international terrorist organization, a foreign terrorist organization, but not for domestic terrorism. We have a federal, in the federal rule statute book, it defines what domestic terrorism is, and that's what guides our investigations. So the FBI defines a domestic violent extremist as a person that is operating inside the United States or primarily inside the United States without direction from a foreign terrorist organization. And that person is trying to further a social or political agenda using threatened or actual force or violence, and they are engaging in a federal violation. So there's several things we have to meet in order to even open a domestic terrorism investigation. I also want to preface that it is a big deal to us in the FBI to call someone a domestic terrorist. That's a label that that person may never lose in their lifetime. So we are very judicious about opening those cases. I also want to explain to you how the FBI defines domestic terrorism in the different categories that we have. The first one is racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. These people are motivated by bias and mostly a racial bias. You have a couple different categories there. Some look, they think the white race is superior and they look for a white genocide. There's also another sect that actually believes in a black homeland. And there's individuals in both of these sectors that actually believe that there's a racial holy war pending. The second category that the FBI defines as domestic violent extremists is anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists. We break these down to anarchist violent extremists, and those people believe in eliminating capitalism and the government structure. Militia violent extremists is another that falls under the anti-government, anti-authority. Those folks believe that our government is incapable of carrying out its duties, and or they have fallen short and need help. So these people see themselves as a kind of vigilante type justice. And then the final category under anti-government, anti-authority is sovereign citizen extremists who just don't recognize our laws. We also have several other categories under domestic violent extremists, and that is animal rights, environmental violent extremists, abortion-related violent extremists, and domestic terrorism other. And the reason this category has come about is we have a lot of confused souls in our country right now, a lot of mixed ideologies, as we call it, and quite frankly, just people that are looking for a purpose. So a lot of times you will see somebody that that might be an environmental violent extremist, but they also have some anarchist beliefs. So a lot of times we will put those open investigations predicated on individuals with those mixed ideologies. When I took this job, and when every other person that has ever worked for the FBI took our jobs, we swore an oath to defend the Constitution, uphold the Constitution, and protect the American people. That involves protecting your constitutional rights, which is First Amendment, Second Amendment, and all the other amendments. First Amendment involves your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and your freedom to redress the government, to bring your grievances. And the Second Amendment is your right to bear arms. So we have to balance these investigations and uphold the Constitution, which is a fine line. And I think the American public sometimes gets, they don't understand, they're a little bit frustrated with the fact that hate is apparent in our everyday culture, and yet we in law enforcement can't do anything about that. And that is because of the First Amendment. If that person crosses the line and there's a threat there, then we most definitely have a little bit more predication to open our investigations. So I just wanted to give you that background of how the FBI looks at domestic terrorism, how we define it, and kind of what our guidelines are for moving forward with our investigations. Again, it's really a pleasure to be here, and kick it back over to Greg.
This is going to be an easy one. It's a toss-up, but it definitely works in my old former section, the domestic terrorism section. And we've heard a lot about domestic terrorism over the last several years. In many, many ways, the Bureau, as the FBI, was founded because of domestic terrorism back in 1908 when anarchists tried to bomb the AG's office here in New York. That led to J. Edgar Hoover being appointed then the Bureau of Investigation. So it's kind of in our DNA, but you'd think that we weren't doing it from then to now. The Bureau's always worked domestic terrorism, but it's one of the toughest violations, as Stephanie alluded to investigate, because we cherish the First Amendment and all the rights that an American has to not be persecuted, not be investigated frivolously or just because of their beliefs. So a lot of times agents decide, hey, it's not for me. The men and women who work in DTOS and look into and have always done it and continue even now as we hear more about domestic terrorism are some of the finest investigators you're going to find. And when you hear sometimes in the media, as you alluded to, that they're not doing this, I can tell you from experience and from continuing to work with my former colleagues, they respect every right that Americans have, they respect the Constitution, and they're investigating appropriately and accurately to make sure that we are all defended. Besides that, I wanted to point out that I see Section Chief in her future, at some point, because I was talking to Director Ray on the way out the back door. So mention that to him. With that, I know I have some questions that I will tee up, and we'd love to take some from the audience, and there's no particular order. But the first one is, and again, no particular order, I'll go to Rabbi Charlie, is you mentioned a lot about preparation, about what you do. How do you start? And it could be specific to a synagogue or a Jewish institution, but a lot of times that's the hardest part. How do you begin? Could you give us some insights?
Right. So in terms of how to begin this process, first of all, I want to say that, I've been Colleyville, CBI in Colleyville, small congregation, right? It was about 160 households when I had left. And Winston-Salem is, Temple Emanuel's not, it's 280 households. It's not a huge, massive congregation. And so to do this work, what you need is, especially in smaller congregations, but in larger institutions as well, you need a champion or two. You need a couple of people like yourselves, maybe, right, who are going to say, this is not going to be easy, but this is of vital importance for our community. And it does take a champion. If it weren't for, at CBI in Colleyville, if it were not for our former president, former House chair, without Mike Finn for really pushing and pushing and pushing, it wouldn't have gotten done. And so to do an emergency action plan, it takes a team, and you have to think through all the different aspects of what you might need. That really does, it's a long process. The idea of calling up the local police department or the sheriff's department to find out who in the community can do a security training, right? To see who in the community can do a security assessment. Those are easier steps, right? Those are relatively easy steps. But then once you get a 16-page document, which we're going to go through next week, about all of the security recommendations, you need to prioritize, and you need to figure out, well, how much is this going to cost? And how much is this going to cost? And how much is this going to cost? And do those costs get to the level where maybe we want to apply for a nonprofit security grant, right, through FEMA, which is a huge lift. It's a heavy lift with the advocacy that I was doing in Congress for this program, which we desperately need. We also need to make it easier for smaller congregations because not everybody has a grant writer on staff. These are real issues, but you need that core group in your community. You need to continue to say, we need to make this a priority. It's really about saying, look, we need to be able to do services, we need to be able to do community gatherings, we need to be able to do relationship building, but we also need to be able to make this a communal priority. We have to take care of these issues, because once they're there, once you do it, it makes everything easier and it makes everybody feel a lot safer and a lot better within that space. It doesn't take care of all threats, but it helps. It makes a big difference.
Thank you, Rabbi. Leigh, I'm going to, and we didn't script this, I'm going to toss one up to you. We've seen, I mean, and especially for the audience, I'm sure just as pertinent as for me, the rise in cyber threats, the rise, we're all finding ourselves more and more in the virtual world. All our information is on there. How are you dealing with this rise? And sometimes when it comes to specifically harassment, how do you deal and intersect with law enforcement and what the public should do? And what can the audience members do to protect themselves?
So when we talk about online harassment, there's sort of three typical buckets of issues that come up. The first is threatening behavior. It's the nasty Twitter comment. It's the creepy DM. And sometimes it also escalates to actually threats of violence. If there's a direct, specific threat, that's where reaching out to law enforcement is something that folks should be considering, given that, you know, even if the fairly typical behavior that one gets back when reporting that, like, hey, I got a death threat on Twitter or whatever, you're not necessarily going to right off the bat get that, like, yes, we're going to send a subpoena to Twitter and find the person's IP address. Like, that doesn't happen. The goal is to establish a paper trail in case the behavior escalates or continues. So there's the whole sort of threat bucket of behaviors. The second set of behaviors that we see with a lot of online threats, online harassment situations, is something called doxing, which is the non-consensual sharing of somebody's personal information. One of the unfortunate things about the United States is there is no single unified federal privacy law. If it's healthcare, we've got HIPAA. If it's education, we've got FERPA. But if you're neither dealing with a healthcare scenario or an education scenario, the privacy protections that Americans have are unfortunately pretty minimal. If you haven't Googled your first name, last name, and city name and found your home address before, it's probably out there, because there are companies that buy and sell wholesale vast amounts of Americans' personal information and just put it online. You combine that with the kinds of threats that people are seeing online, with the ease of finding and locating individuals' home addresses, and you've got a recipe for in real life violence. So as an initial step, just having a look at, if somebody wanted to, like, if I wanted to go pick on Greg, how easy would it be for me to find his home address? That is something that every individual can do for themselves, and there are resources out there for taking that information down to make it just a little bit easier. The goal is to have just a little bit more friction. If someone decides to target you, that it's just that much more difficult to find your information. The third type of escalation that we see with online harassment is account takeovers and account hacking. And this is something where the same kind of situations, the same kind of attacks that someone deals with in an online harassment situation, these are the same kind of things that happen when, like, your uncle's Facebook gets hacked. Typically, these are due to, you know, everybody's got a zillion different online accounts. We all share the same password between different accounts. These are sort of normal security practices or mispractices that people have. And just stepping up that general level of personal cybersecurity practices is both going to be very protective from the online harassment situation, but it's also going to be really protective from other kinds of online scams and fraud, which we're seeing a huge increase. Who in the room has gotten a really weird wrong number text in the yeah, it's like everybody, right?
Take a look around.
Okay, I'm a little obsessed with these scams right now. They're called pig butchering, and it's basically a combination of a romance scam and cryptocurrency fraud. So don't reply to the wrong number texts. Like, people have lost millions of dollars to these scammers. And further weirdness, the scammers themselves are often victims of human trafficking. So just don't engage. You get that wrong number text. I bring this up as an example. The same kind of situational awareness, you now know. If your spidey sense goes off when you're talking with a friend or family member about this, like, weird conversation that they're having, dig in, and this is how we keep each other safe. one of the things that comes up a lot around online harassment and personal cybersecurity is people are like, oh, you know, I don't have anything to hide. Somebody hacks into my email, whatever. We're all the custodians of each other's secrets in many ways. Maybe you don't have anything to hide, but a sibling or a loved one shared something about a health issue or a divorce that they're going through with you over email. Your email gets hacked, that other person is now subject to all sorts of problems. So being that sort of peer support and peer security services for each other, I think, is a really important part of how we stay safe.
And you can see from just Leigh's brief description to her why we go to her, and she talks me off many ledges, many times. It's also, her Tall Poppy is not just for companies or anything, individuals. I highly recommend I saw all the hands go up. It might be worth a call.
The other specific resource I wanted to mention, Consumer Reports, of all places, has an absolutely wonderful tool called Security Planner. It's just securityplanner.org. It is a how-to that's frequently updated on personal cybersecurity practices related to online harassment, fraud, scams, all this stuff. Love it. It's an amazing piece of software, free to use.
Thank you, Leigh. Evan, talk a little bit about CSS, which again we ally with all the time. How does that fit in with our partners, not only ADL, the Secure Community Network, others, CSI up there, and private security and local law enforcement?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think it really even plays to what Rabbi talked about the importance of the different organizations that are in the space and how we're all working together. And I think it's imperative to know that when you are a congregational rabbi or a leader in your particular synagogue, there is an alphabet soup of different organizations kind of within the security space right now. And I think, but we're all each doing very separate, important things, and we're trying, and we are really working in synergy together in order to give the best options to congregations and communities. And I think when you look at our partners, and one of the first things I did when I started was work with Jonathan and you and about signing the MOU with the ADL and working with the Center on Extremism and having our over 2,000 active volunteers to be able to report incidents back so the anti-Semitism audit could be as robust as possible, and having that partnership and be able to communicate when things happen on the ground. Or with SCAN, also we have a memorandum of understanding with the Secure Communities Network, which is part of Eric Fingerhut and JFNA and Michael Masters, who runs SCAN. It's critical because the kind of training that Rabbi Colleyville and his congregation got was so critical. We don't do that. We as volunteer security training, we actually want to outsource to our partners. We're not looking to overlap and do the kind of things that the Center on Extremism is doing. We're not looking to do the Stop the Bleed trainings or the Harden the Target or the grant writing work that SCAN does so well. We do the volunteer security. We're that third kind of tripod, if you will, third leg in the tripod to get teams outside and out front. And again, when something happens like we saw in New Jersey last week, where there was a threat, we're all working together behind the scenes how to best disseminate that information to our community, whether it's community leadership, working with the FBI, working with local law enforcement, working with the Center on Extremism, working with the SCAN's duty desk, to be able to work in synergy, because I think a lot of times in the Jewish communal space, we see so much overlap. We see so many people working within silos, and that is not something that we can let happen in security. So when we're working with local law enforcement, with our volunteers, we're making sure we're doing it in synergy with our law enforcement partners at the federal level and with our partners within the Jewish communal space at SCN, in ADL, in Jewish Federations in North America. Because if we're not doing that, then honestly, we're less secure as a community, and we cannot afford to have that. And so one quick story is I was actually at a synagogue speaking a few months ago. It's a brand new synagogue, and they had, it was all glass on a very main corner of this community. And we had a team there, we had a CSS team. But I asked the head of our team, I said, listen, have you ever done a threat assessment? No. Have you ever done the Stop the Bleed training? No. Have you ever done, working with grants that bring money in to be able to do this? No. So that first call was to Mitch Silber, who is the head of the CSI, which is part of the SCN network, who runs security for the Jewish Federation here in New York. And right away, his team member was able to go work with our CSS volunteers to help get those threat assessments done and be able to work together. So it's a synergistic thing that's critical. It's all about partnership. It's all about working together, all for one common goal, which is a better and safer Jewish communal space.
Thank you, Evan. And Stephanie, I wanted this to tee you up, as Evan just kind of alluded to, and those of you who are probably aware, we had that incident in New Jersey, which the Bureau just announced over with the U.S. attorneys in New Jersey. They have arrested the individual who made those threats to the community. It took a little longer. But we've heard a lot about the partnerships that the Bureau and law enforcement have, kind of with the organized partnerships with the private sector, with ADL, with the volunteer, with the CSS. Tell a little bit about what do you think the public can do to fight this domestic extremism, domestic terrorism? How can they help?
Such a great question, such an important question. I think the easy answer that I will say is, and you will be able to remember this, is see something, say something. Beyond that, let me expand. So the FBI is great, but it's only because of the people that work for the FBI, but more importantly, the relationships we have with our local police departments, with our community members, and organizations like ADL, our JCCs, and all of the different religious organizations, educational organizations, et cetera, et cetera. When I was a supervisor in Little Rock, I owned my territory. That was my responsibility for international terrorism and domestic terrorism. And I made a point to go visit the synagogues, to go visit the mosques, to go visit the Catholic churches, and met with those religious leaders. And I understand firsthand the difficult position you're in, because you want to welcome people in to your houses of worship, because that's part of what you do. But at the same time, you have to also, in this day and age, unfortunately, we live in a world where you have to be skeptical. And so it was my job to kind of educate folks on that balance, and to see, and just because you tell us something, because you see something, doesn't mean anything negative. Let FBI, let us do our job to vet said suspicious information or suspicious person, and then go forward. We were very successful in Little Rock in the fact that the different communities set up a text chain where if they see something suspicious at their synagogue or whatever church, they would set up a text, because some of these subjects, I should say, will travel to different institutions. And that was really important to our small community in Little Rock, and I think that could be duplicated around the country. So our relationships are critical. I saw it firsthand in stopping activity or just vetting it out where it was a very simple thing to explain away. So our relationships are critical. Again, see something, say something. I can't say it enough. Let us do our job. Let us vet it, and then we'll go forward. But even if you think it's something small, it could be really big to us, so I appreciate it.
Thank you, and I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. I'm going to do a quick follow-up question,
Okay.
Especially for the public. Tell me a little bit about what are the indicators. It's always famous in the Bureau. Everybody always asks, or in law enforcement, how do I know?
Yeah.
How if I'm sitting in a room at an audience, and there'll probably be some follow-up with Rabbi Charlie on this. But again, members of the public here who are asking, what should I be aware of? Are there indicators? Is there something I should know? We say something, say something, and it's so important that you do that. But what can they look for?
Okay, so the FBI has looked at a number of different incidents over the past decades and studied them and tried to understand this. And none of what I'm about to tell you is in it of itself a singular pointer of something that's about to happen. I'm just going to give you a couple examples that could be indicators. But again, please don't take it singularly as an indicator. And I think the statistic is over 95% of critical incidents that have happened, at least one person in that perpetrator's life knew something was going to happen. I think it might be even closer to 98%. So there's at least one person in somebody's life that could have said something and stopped it. There is a process by which we've seen that these perpetrators, these subjects, go through a radicalization period to mobilization. And this could be anywhere from a radicalization period could be months to years, and a mobilization period could be very short. So it's really critical for the Bureau to try to get in there and stop as soon as we see that somebody might be moving towards mobilizing. So when you look at the radicalization aspect, you're looking at the person's motivation. Again, talking about that social political ideology. And then are they taking it a step further and they're talking now about specific targets that they would like to attack? Are they producing or ingesting violent material? Are they posing with weapons? Are they on chat rooms that have violent rhetoric? So you're looking at the person's motivation. And then to take it a step further, you're looking at, is this person preparing? Let's look at the preparation stage. So now is that person purchasing explosives? Are they purchasing military grade style equipment? Are they purchasing extra firearms? Are they doing surveillance? Is there unusual travel? Are they trying to conceal their activities, kind of a change in their behavior? Are they either online or in person? And then you're looking at that mobilization time period, which again is really critical that we get in as before this happens, ideally. And that is when the person might be saying unusual goodbyes or publishing a last will, or you've probably heard many people talk about a manifesto, and then specific information about where they'd like to commit an attack or against who, a specific population, a specific person. So in that last phase, the mobilization phase, you're going to see a lot of specificity. The problem is that last phase could be minutes, it could be hours, it could be months. But it's unfortunately a lot of the time we have stopped it. But that's where we really need the public to help us. If you see somebody that's just going that, even before that, please call us, please call your local law enforcement, tell somebody. We have excellent relationships in our joint terrorism task forces across the country. Tell somebody.
Thank you, and I will just echo on that for a second, is every scene I've ever responded to, either in the FBI or the ADL, and my colleagues here will tell you the same thing. It's always as you interview and you talk to people, next door neighbors, always, I kind of thought so. I kind of noticed something, but I didn't want to say anything. And God forbid it leads to something else. So please, if you see something, say something, report it to somebody. Don't be the unprofessional investigator. Let the professionals handle it, and if it's nothing, then you have a clear conscience and people can move on. But let the professionals do that. As we wrap this up, what I'd like to do is just go down and give each one of my very fine panelists just a minute, to say, what's a takeaway? The audience is leaving here today. What would you like them to take away from this or have in their mind? And I'll start with Evan.
The biggest thing is, just do something. Not only take the lessons of you see something, say something, but take the knowledge you have now around anti-Semitism and the climate that we're in as a Jewish community and find a way to actually do something. Don't just come to the conference and then just talk about it at your Shabbat table or with your family and friends or tweet about it. Actually do something about it, and there's lots of options here to get engaged, and we hope that you take one of those options and actually do get engaged in the pushing back against anti-Semitism. And I just want to say this because of the opportunity, because I'm sitting next to Greg. Greg is a friend. Greg has been an absolute amazing partner for us at CSS. On the phone with us, texting with us, emailing, giving us insider baseball on things that were happening last week in New Jersey. Does it consistently. You cannot ask for a better partner or friend in Greg, and the ADL's lucky to have you. We're lucky to be able to work with you, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was unexpected. And he did just tell the FBI that I told him all the secrets as they're sitting here. Rabbi Charlie.
For everything that you've heard up here, there are resources out there. You don't know how to do an emergency action plan, you can literally Google it and get examples. It's not going to be your way, but...
Hello?
It's not going to be your way necessarily. Does this work? Oh, it does. It's not going to be your way, but it at least gives you a foundation, something to work with. And so know that no matter what it is, it may be a lot, but there are resources out there. And finally, this is not the world that we want to live in. This is not the world we want to live in. And so that idea of taking that message that, right, the ADL's message, there's no place for hate. There's no place for hate against us. There's no place for hate against anyone. We need to live that. each and every day. We need to develop the relationships in whatever way we can, because that ultimately leads to the greater security for all of us. And that's really the hope, right? That's the world that we want to live in. And so we wish that we didn't have to take these steps. We wish that this panel wasn't necessary. Unfortunately it is. But we have work to do on both ends of that spectrum. We have to find ways to be secure. We have to find ways to reduce the hate. And that's something all of us can do on both parts.
Thank you, Rabbi Charlie. Leigh.
I think just in addition to there is a lot of stuff that folks can do, as Evan said, as Rabbi Charlie said, we can do this together. The third piece I would add is that doing this work, working with each other to keep each other safe, it will actually make you feel better. It makes you feel better, and it also actually makes you safer, so that's like a pretty good combination. But I think the additional piece too, not only does it make you feel better about the state of the world and make you feel like you have a community to keep each other safe, but taking these actions in advance lets people go forth and be more confident in speaking out, in being part of the public dialogue, and building that society that we want to live in.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Last but not least, I just kind of want to echo what the other panelists said. Is first of all, I can ensure you that the men and women of the FBI are working extremely hard to keep you safe, and we take great pride in that every single day. But the only way we can do that is through a community effort and together. We need you. We need your friends and family, and through that we hopefully will take great strides in our future generations to combat these extremists.
Thank you, and I want to point out that we kept it on time, on target. Thank you for having us today. Stay safe.